welcome to this Linguistics in the Pub, which is linguists who podcast engaging a broader audience with research in linguistics. It is either the 20th or 21st of August, depending on your time zone. We have people joining us from across the international date line and across time zones today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Linguistics in the Pub is usually a Melbourne-based event and held on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and welcome all Indigenous and First Nations people who are joining us today. And we're being joined by podcasters who are coming to us from many nations country today. The note of warning that we are recording this session, so if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat. We'll have the opportunity to, depending on how we go for time, have you ask questions directly to the panelists at the end of the initial conversation session. And if we have enough time, we'll go into breakout rooms for further discussion if people are able to stick around for that. I'm delighted to be wearing kind of two hats today. My first is as a regular organizer of Linguistics in the Pub, which is an informal conversation event held traditionally back when we used to meet up in person in Melbourne monthly-ish. The spirit of being in the pub is not is more for the conviviality and the opportunity to informally discuss issues that face us as researchers, both theoretical and practical, and I guess a bit more personal than kind of standard linguistics discussions. Of course, Zoom makes it a bit harder for it to be a free-form chat, so we're structuring this a bit more like a panel discussion. And it is in that panel discussion, I'm also wearing my other hat as a researcher who is passionate about communicating linguistics to broader audiences. And one of my favorite ways of doing that is through podcasting. And so I've taken this opportunity to assemble, well, I mean, obviously 3 of my favorite, but that's kind of, you know, one of them is my own child. So it would be a bit of a worry if they weren't 3 of my favorite podcast teams to talk about linguistics and podcasting today. I'm going to introduce them in the order of age of the podcast, which is actually not as straightforward an order of introduction as you might think. So our kind of newest / oldest podcast team here, the Because Language team, we're joined by Daniel Midgley from WA and Hedvig Hiergaard, who's joining us from Germany, where it is very early in the morning. It's probably more appropriate pub time than it is here at 11 a.m. in Melbourne.
Yep.
They're joined on Because Language by non-linguist but clever person Ben Ainsley. Because Language is 6 episodes old. So a teeny tiny fledgling podcast, but actually is a phoenix from the ashes of Talk the Talk, which had 395 episodes ranging all the way back to 2010. So a decade of podcasting under the belt for Daniel Midgley there. The middle child of this trio today is Lingthusiasm, hosted by myself, Lauren Gorn, and Gretchen McCulloch, who is waving at you there. We started podcasting in late 2016 and we're coming up on 100 episodes, Gretchen.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
We have 47, as of an hour ago, 47 main episodes and slightly fewer bonus episodes. And then the last but not least of our podcasting trio today are the Vocal Fries, Carrie Gillen, joining us from Canada. Are you in Canada?
No,
Sorry,
I'm still in the States.
See, this is the magic of podcasting, is that we can exist everywhere and anywhere. And Megan Figueroa also joining us from the United States today. Hi,
I'm in Canada,
Megan.
I guess.
Hello.
Yes, you are our Canadian representative. The Vocal Fries have been podcasting since mid-2017 and have over 70 episodes. So I kind of, suddenly we're all, it feels like only yesterday we were just starting, and we're now 3 established podcasts. Brings me great joy. I have 3 questions that I would like to put to each of the podcast teams, and I will do it in a slightly different order, depending on my whim each time. If you have any follow-up questions or extra things you'd like to ask, please pop them in the chat and I will try and incorporate them as we're chatting. I'd like to start with maybe because language for the first question, because I'd like to ask why you decided on a podcast in particular, especially for maybe Daniel will have some insights into this, given that I know Talk the Talk started as an internet show, but what prompted you to branch into podcasting as well in sharing Talk the Talk?
Well, it kind of came to me. The show Talk the Talk began as a radio show. Professor Alan Dench was the one who was doing it, and he handed it off to me, and I just would go into the RTR-FM studios every Tuesday and do a show, just a 7-minute thing. But then I was kind of annoyed that it would just sort of disappear into the ether. So I wanted to give it a second life. So I think a lot of radio shows actually get second lives as podcasts. And so that's what I did. I started podcasting and it grew. It got to be 15 minutes, then half an hour, then a full hour. Now, because language, it's just as long as we want to be. We're no longer associated with radio. We're podcast only. And also the podcasting scene is exciting. It's what we've wanted to do. It's where I it sort of took over my regular job. And so now this is what I'm doing. Hedvig, what's your perspective on the podcast scene?
I am an excessive podcast listener. I was just, as Danny was talking to me, was going to say, I looked up my my podcast addict, my player statistics from last year. So last year I listened to over 33 days of podcasts. And that's about a typical year for me. And I found Talk the Talk by just like going like Linguistics podcast in like 2015 or something. And I was really, I don't know if this is a good answer, but I'm a big podcast. I think it's the best way of reaching people. It's the best way of reaching me. So if I want to reach anyone like me, the way to go.
Good logical extension there. Gretchen, I feel a bit disingenuous asking you why you started a podcast, because I know, but for everyone else, why, after blogging and writing for the general public online and in print, what was compelling about podcasting as a medium to share linguistics?
Well, I think so, as Lauren and I both had linguistics blogs for quite a while. And I think what compels you about podcasts as a medium is that it can be conversational. And you have this nice sort of balance between a sort of back and forth conversational with a certain amount of editing so that you get a sort of polished conversation that you can put out. And so it's a different sort of engagement that you get with writing. It can be longer. You have people's attention for a bit of a longer time because it's not just, okay, you got to read this thing and people don't necessarily want to read it all that much. And you get this sort of kind of personal, friendly, engaged atmosphere. A lot of the podcasts that I listened to were sort of a conversational style podcast where you feel like you get to know the hosts. So yeah, I think that, kind of expanding into a different format because you get bored with blogging eventually. And then also just, having the ability to sort of have a conversation and sort of bring people in to listen in on the conversations that linguists have in the pub or in various places, but make it as if the difficult parts of the vocabulary or the complex jargon and so on that kind of falls away, and it's just sort of you're having the attitude of a linguist, but you're not necessarily having the difficulty of actually listening to a real linguistic conversation, or the creepiness of listening in on actual linguists who you're following around with a microphone.
I feel like you've given the really noble and honorable answer there, but I think like in fairness, I think part of why we started Lingthusiasm is that we just wanted an excuse to work on a project together, and talking to each other about linguistics was something we enjoyed. So it made sense as an extension of that.
Yeah, also we met at a conference and we were like, oh, do you want to have a podcast?
Yeah, it was a summer school, so we'd been talking for like 10 days straight, and I was like, oh, we still haven't run out of things to talk about in linguistics. we could probably share these conversations. So I like that there was definitely the honorable reason, but I think it's also fair to point out that like just wanted an excuse to keep chatting.
We thought it would be fun. Yeah, we thought it would be fun.
Megan and Carrie, you also knew each other and worked together before starting a podcast. So what was the thinking behind why the Fries should be in pod form?
We'd never actually worked together.
Oh, you haven't?
No, she was my student a long time ago.
Yeah.
And then we became friends. So no, there was never any work really.
Right. Yeah.
So originally, I just, it's 2017. Everything seemed to be falling apart, and the one thing, so there are a lot of people who are really obviously caring a lot more about, oh, look at how racist Trump is and how sexist he is, blah blah blah, and then saying sexist and racist things. So it's like they couldn't quite make the connection that, language actually is one of the ways that you can be ist in some way or another. So linguistic discrimination has always been a thing that linguists always talk about. Day one, we're like, okay, stop judging language. And I realized, well, if I'm not going to be teaching anymore, because I was no longer teaching, maybe I need to tell more people. And I'm also a huge podcast listener. I was just listening to an old episode of Reply All. So
yeah, me too.
So it was just something I enjoyed a lot. So I thought, hey, maybe this would be a good venue for chastising people in hopefully a nice, friendly way. But
friendly
but just teaching them.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, it's like we're salty and it's okay. But I thought, oh, I don't want to do it alone. I think it'd be very boring if it's just me. So I thought, oh, Megan also cares about this. I knew she would care about this. So I thought I'd ask her, and she said, yeah.
Yeah, and going back to the whole conversational thing, I mean, we have been friends for 12 years. So we have conversations like this all the time over dinner and such. So it felt right. Absolutely. And I wanted to be like Sarah Koenig. I was like, yeah, okay. I mean, who says I can't be the next Sarah Koenig?
I am so unsurprised to discover that we all enjoy consuming podcasts as well as making them.
Yeah,
so
really, it's all for the fame and glory.
It's good to have aspirations. Thank you all for sharing your motivations for choosing this format in particular. What choices have you made deliberately about how you choose to cover linguistics? I am going to direct this question to the Fries first, because I now regularly, when I read bad takes on Twitter, I just hear "don't be an asshole" in my head, and it brings me great joy. And I feel like you have a very explicit set of decisions that you made about how you choose to cover, or what your approach to covering linguistics in a podcast is. So if you want to share some of that motivation with, I assume a whole bunch of the people who are listening, who have joined us for Linguistics in the Pub, know Vocal Fries, and some people may be subscribing right now as we're chatting. So what choices have you made in how you approach linguistics?
So even though neither of us are a sociolinguist, basically this is a sociolinguistics podcast, because when you're talking about linguistic discrimination, you're talking about the social aspect of language. So yeah, that was we had to decide how to cover that, because it's not either of our areas of expertise. So for us, if we're talking about something that we feel comfortable talking about, like vocal fry, then we don't need a guest. But if it's anything like outside of either of our identities, we need to have a guest. And sometimes they're linguists and sometimes they're not. And both are really useful, interesting conversations that you can have. So for example, we had a conversation with someone from New Jersey, not a linguist. And it was such a fun conversation because everyone got upset that he said Central Jersey doesn't exist.
And how are we supposed to talk about, you know, the New Jersey accent? There's no way we could talk about that. And there's no right for us to talk about African American language or for us to talk about these other things. So it's absolutely it's actually like these decisions were made for us because we just find people that do have these experiences. And that's right, they don't have to be linguists. We had a poet talk about borderland Spanish, borderland English. I mean, it was beautiful. We got to talk to a poet and it was just like, you know, we aren't sociolinguists, but we get to have these amazing people on that teach us at the same time, which I think kind of makes it endearing too, where it's like, oh, we're not pretending to know everything. We're learning with you and we get to meet these people with you kind of thing.
Yeah. How do you go about, do you have a we would like to explore this area of language use and then look for guests, or do guests kind of come to you and then you both decide? Yeah,
both.
And we've had great guests from both, right? Where we're like, I'm so glad you contacted us. We would have never thought to, not because we don't care about you, because we don't know who you are. And it's great that you reached out. Yeah.
So I guess the take home message for people there is, if you do have an experience that fits with the way a show pitches linguistics, then if they do interviews frequently, that's an opportunity for you to reach out and draw that connection there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a conversation, right? Like, we would be happy to meet more people and have these conversations and have and put their voices out there. We have so many gaps in what we've done so far. We've done this for 3 years, but, you know, we haven't talked about Asian languages. We haven't, you know, there's just things that we haven't done because, you know, job security, there's so many ways that we can discriminate against language and different languages and all of this. So yeah, and Twitter helps a lot too, actually. We find other linguists on Twitter where they talk about their research they just did. Like we recently interviewed Kendra Calhoun because she had just said that she, you know, she shared a paper that she did about Vine, and we're like, okay, I know I wanted to talk to her before, but now this is the time. I got to get in her DMs and be like, this is the time, please come on to our show. So Twitter is like probably where we get 95%.
I feel like so many linguistics communication and research communication training things I do are like, just join Twitter. It's where everyone hangs out, and don't be afraid to use it as an opportunity to share your work. Not necessarily because you will be interviewed on a podcast, but you'll just get to be part of the conversation. Hedwig and Daniel, I feel like it's still pretty fair to say, because Language is the only podcast committed to doing linguistics in the news and really topical content consistently. That's one thing I notice about your approach to covering linguistics, but what are some of the other decisions you've made in how to shape the show?
Hedwig, you want to start with this one?
Yeah, so I should maybe explain, Daniel, why I'm on the show.
Yeah.
Because I was looking for a linguistics podcast, and I explicitly wanted one that I was getting tired of a particular one in Sweden, which was very focused on just etymology of words and Swedish words. And as a linguist, I found it a little bit. I wanted more coverage of linguistics news, and then I found Talk the Talk, and I just, because I do this sometimes, I just send a random like fan email to Daniel and just went, "Your show's really good." And like no hooks after that. And he said, "Oh, do you want to come on and talk about this thing?" And I did, and then later I got roped into just being a co-host. But I explicitly really like thinking about, I think linguistics is interesting, and I think linguistics research is interesting, and some linguists are more or less good at communicating that, but most linguistics research is interesting. And I'm really happy we have the slant of bringing, like you said, Lauren, like the news, both the news and how we can have a linguistic slant on it, but also like what's happening research-wise. So I try and keep out for research articles that I find interesting, and then think about if Daniel and Ben would have something interesting to say about them. Because there are lots of interesting research that we can't really add so much to, but something that's actually a conversation starter. And then try and see if we can get them on to talk about it. We've had lots of fun guests like that. And I'm looking forward to many more. But yeah, I feel the same way like the vocal fries as well, that we both have topic ideas and then contact people. Sometimes we get contacted. Often I actually, in my mind, fixate on a person first, that I think like that person is interesting and is good at talking and does interesting research. And then we talk to them and see if they want to talk about a particular
And how do you find these interesting people who are sharing their research?
Twitter is very good.
Oh, Linguist Twitter.
Everyone mentioned.
Ah.
Yeah, Linguist Twitter is very good. Find a lot of things, but also actually just like my department has a journal club. We read journal articles. Actually, just keeping on top of the linguistics literature in itself, so to speak.
Very often I'll find a news story, and that's how we found Stephanie Shi with the Pokemon names. You know, they did a paper and said, you know, you can tell the evolvedness and the size of a Pokemon by their name. Really? Okay, that's something that everybody can relate to. So, you know, we've done a lot of things now where we have guests on the show, but also when I'm putting a show together, I also try to find news items that guest can comment on, because you know, something that's kind of in their area, and that's sort of the complex process of putting a show together that will cohere and that people will like. But yeah, we find a lot of people through news items. Something will pop up that's fresh, and I'll say, "Oh, I've been meaning to talk to that person," and then it's off to Twitter. Yeah, that's about the process.
So this is definitely the value add of having, like thinking about podcasts as opposed to conventional media, is that you actually have linguists running podcasts about linguistics instead of someone who's a journalist, and like less journalists, and some of them have like great and perceptive opinions about language, but a journalist being like, I write words, I like language, and then you're like, oh, there was actually a better story underneath the story you thought you were doing. And that's why I really appreciate the kind of the deep cut and the value add that you get from having media run by people who actually know the area and know the people operating in it, and often know what the kind of context of a story is so much better.
And you don't get Bob Garfield complaining about vocal fry while he's frying.
Right. Yep, exactly.
Yes.
The previous host of Lexicon Valley of a podcast. Yeah.
As just one particularly brilliant example of that potential pratfall.
Sometimes linguists realize that something is interesting that hasn't even occurred to people who are, you know, running a show or something. And especially for, you know, when I write things for a general audience, I can pitch a story to an editor and say like, hey, I had this idea. I think this would be really interesting. Cover this person's research or whatever. And I can pitch that. But if you are being quoted in the news, and that's pretty much how you get on radio, is it's hard. There aren't a lot of people who have linguistics backgrounds that are working on the producing side in radio, which I wish there were, but there aren't at the moment. But for radio, people often they already have their idea of what they want to be a story, and they're approaching you to try to get their quote and their soundbite for their story that they've already decided on. And it's harder to even have that idea of like, oh, here's this thing we could pitch. Here's this thing that we think would be interesting. Or like, here's this angle on this story, like vocal fry. It's good, actually. You just don't have the openness to do that. And we don't, you know, none of us have to justify we want to justify to non-linguists because we have a lot of non-linguists in our audience, all of us, and make it interesting there, but we don't have to justify to a producer like this topic is worth covering.
So what other choices have you made, Gretchen, in your podcast that I have no insights on about? It's wearing these two hats at the same time is very silly. But do you want to maybe tell people about some of the choices that we have made in our approach to covering topics on Lingthusiasm?
Yeah, I think in contrast to the sort of different approaches, at least for the purposes of this panel, a lot of what we do with Lingthusiasm is we try to pick topics that are sort of perennial interest linguistics topics that are kind of maybe fairly big or difficult conceptual topics that you might approach from a theoretical level, and that might be like one slide in a lecture. And we spend a whole half hour on what could be like that one slide. So we recently did an episode about adjectives, the one that went out like an hour ago. And at first you think, okay, adjectives, oh great, they describe words, they're fine. Well, we ended up talking about words, you know, do adjectives actually exist, and how is the category of adjective valid cross-linguistically, and this kind of stuff that you might not get to in a linguistics course until you're at an upper year level or maybe a graduate level, but you can actually talk through without getting too technical at a sort of conceptual level, you know, are adjectives even valid? And sort of in the bigger question of like, when you're looking at from one language to another, are the categories that you bring with you, are they necessarily valid when you're looking from one language to another? And that's a sort of big picture question that a lot of people, if they think of adjectives, they think, oh, I look up this word in the dictionary and like, it says it's an adjective, therefore it is. But like, where does that information come from? So I think that like a lot of times the episodes that we produce get used in classes sometimes, because we'll do like, okay, here's, you know, transitive verbs, but we won't use the word transitive in it at all. We'll have this elaborate metaphor of a coat rack or something like this. So trying to break down some of these concepts that are sometimes approached in a dry way and be like, you can actually get really excited about something that is sometimes approached in a dry way, because if you think about where that information comes from and not just like memorize this list, it can be a fun way to approach that. So I think the idea of like always asking why and always asking where did we get this information and how did it come together, and spending a really long time chatting through a lot of fun examples for one thing, rather than being like, here's a slide, here's a definition, go memorize it, you're done, which you have to do in a class sometimes. But the half-hour podcast format allows you that elaboration to really get deeply into a particular topic, and that can work for theoretical issues just as it can for, you know, current events or for, you know, interviewing people and this kind of stuff.
It's definitely the biggest gear shift I have to do between like teaching and research brain and podcast brain. And the thing that I end up having to like rephrase and gets cut the most is like the real focus we have on not introducing any more terminology than is absolutely needed. There are so many times where I'll say something and then I'll be like, hang on, I'm going to say literally the same thing, but I'm not going to use the word transitive or clause or whatever. So that's definitely the biggest shift for, you know, in a lecture, just because of the way a lecture works. I have to subject students, you know, I've just finished putting together a morphology lecture for next week, and morphology is unrelenting in terminology. But when we talk about, when we talk about on the show, like we just don't use any of that. Sorry, go ahead, Wig.
I know, I was going to ask if you have noticed it impacting your teaching. I don't know if I can ask you questions.
Yeah, that's
also
fine.
Yeah. No, but like, do you think you've become a better teacher from podcasting?
I think I am more committed to ensuring that the lectures also focus on the joy of what we're learning as much as, and I'm probably much less committed to ensuring students absolutely have the terminology down pat, because we don't do closed book exams. Students, like, if they really don't remember the difference between a circumfix and an infix, or what language is a polysynthetic and what language is, like, what's an agglutinating language, like, there are heaps of linguistics terms that I end up double checking on Wikipedia all the time, and I'm a full-time linguist. Like, I'd rather they just know that possibility space is out there and what they should be searching for. So I'm probably less hung up on terminology and more hung up on, or more interested in conveying the bigger conceptual space now. That's probably the biggest difference from how I was teaching 10 years ago.
I definitely read the like pedagogy literature more and differently. Like, I read kind of myth-busting literatures and pedagogy literatures more. There's this really great study that I cite all the time, which I'm going to cite again here, which if you think about when you learn the word Schadenfreude, you're like, wow, what a great word. Like, this describes this feeling that I have had. Like, this is so exciting. I've learned the word Schadenfreude. And versus if you think about how you learned the word maybe existentialism, where you like walked into a classroom and the English teacher had written on the board like existentialism. Today, class, we're going to be learning about existentialism. Existentialism was invented in like a decade by some people, blah blah blah, and you still don't know what it is. And this, it's there's a study that looks at showing people explaining to people the concept first, and then giving them the word for it. So that's like learning Schadenfreude because you already felt Schadenfreude, versus giving people here's the jargon, and then now I'm going to explain what it is. And we have a real tendency to do the second one as experts, but the first one is a lot easier for learners, for new people to deal with a topic. And I think that's really influenced how I introduce people to the topic. To topics as well. So like, it's what I did right now by being like, let me explain this distinction. You know how this word was more fun to learn than this other word. It's related to this concept first, jargon second paper, which, of like motivating why you want to know something before introducing people to the term. Because then even if you forget the term, you still have this core idea. Whereas if you remember the word, but you don't know what it means anymore, you haven't really learned that much.
Congrats on managing to do concept first, jargon second with concept first, jargon second.
Thank you.
Good job.
And I found there's a good piece of utility. Sometimes people have peeves a lot, and there'll be a thing in language and they'll be like, oh, I don't know about that. And then you'll say, hey, this is so common that we actually have a term for it in linguistics. It's a known thing. It's something we know about. And it's called, I don't know, then insert ablaut reduplication or yod dropping. And then once they know that, oh, this is a thing, there's a term for it. And so they worry less.
That comes with some baggage though, because they worry less because a bunch of fancy linguists in the university put a term on it, right?
It's what we do.
Yes.
Whatever works.
No, but I mean,
whatever works.
Yeah, no, but there's a lot of fun things that we haven't put words on that are they all have value intrinsically before they got
This
words.
is true. This is true.
Yeah. Sorry to be the party pooper, but
yeah,
no.
I do a double take of like, I shouldn't have to give you permission to be okay with this. And yet, if it makes you feel better, I will give you that permission and let you know that you don't actually need my permission in the future. You know.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what we do is just encourage people to feel like it's okay to seek out answers when they're looking for them, as much as it is like, I'm very realistic that like someone could listen to all of Lingthusiasm and probably remember a few anecdotes. Like, we're not here to give people a linguistics exam at the end of listening to an episode. So we just want them to come away with a general enthusiasm for the topic. I have a kind of general question, because obviously I'm very interested in your motivations. I think if people listen to your shows or now subscribe and start listening, it's always nice to know why people do what they do. But I think there's also an opportunity to take the lessons we've learned as, I think we've got a pretty even split between people who are still research or who are currently research active linguists and people who have taken linguistics into other careers and areas. And I really appreciate that. I think that's pretty evenly split across the shows. And I really appreciate that diversity of linguistic perspectives, obviously, but encouraging more linguists to think of themselves as communicators for the discipline and advocates for the discipline. And sometimes people tell me about a new linguistics communication project as though I should be worried that someone's encroaching on the turf. And I'm just like, no, that like the more the merrier. Like we are like, I want there to be more linguistics communication, because we're competing with like people watching basketball, not competing with each other. And so to encourage people to either like not necessarily start a whole podcast, but to think about taking their passion or their research interest and ensuring that they're not just communicating inside the discipline, but communicating what they do to a larger audience. What advice do you wish to impart upon people who want to talk to broader audiences, or kind of should take that opportunity to, And I might start with Because Language here, because I know you guys do a really great job of supporting people who are maybe doing their first podcast interview about their work. And so I'm interested in your perspective on this.
What do you reckon, Hedvig?
You can have a piece of advice each. You can have multiple pieces. It's not a one shot.
I always think that it's good to try to explain things to your mum, someone who's patient with you, and who and try and see what part of the things that you think are interesting in the discipline your mum will find interesting, and then start from there. This sounds very crazy, but it's actually kind of been helpful to me, at least. I had an existential crisis both after my bachelor and my master, and I just finished my PhD, so I'll probably have another one about what does it all mean and what's the point of it all. But talking to people outside of the discipline and trying to explain concepts to them grounds me and makes me realize what we're doing and why, and that is why I do any of this communication stuff at all. So if you have that kind of instinct in you, just go based on that. I don't know if that's a good answer.
That is a good answer. The number of times Gretchen has come to me and been like, I have an idea for an episode because I talked to someone at a party and they told me about this thing they found weird, and now we can do a whole episode on homogenic nasal assimilation. And I'm just like, you go to great parties.
Yeah, people are interested. No, but honestly, we had a linguistics conference in Canberra a while ago, and I was at a pub and someone started chatting to me, and I was like, oh, they were like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm a linguist. And this person was like, why is there so many languages in the world? And I was like, well, you've come to the right one. Let's talk about this. And turned out he wasn't hitting on me. He was there with his mate, and I talked to them for 40 minutes, and we had a great time. And I went back to my friends, and I told my friends about this. And my friend, who's a linguist who's not as interested in talking to random strangers, was like, oh, when I tell them I'm a linguist, they all just look so bored. So I've started lying and saying I'm a ballerina. And I was like, you're doing something not right. Linguistics is intrinsically interesting.
Hedvig, it's very endearing that you thought someone asking why there are so many languages in the world was a chat up line.
Why?
I would too.
See? No, but people are usually really interested. And like Daniel said, starting from people's pet peeves is a great entrance for a lot of people. But linguistics, everyone has language around them all the time, and they think about it a lot. And yeah, everyone finds linguistics interesting. You just gotta present it the right way.
Yeah, my advice would be, if you're a person who does linguistics and you want to communicate more, avail yourself of us. You don't have to start your own podcast, although I would love it if you did. But we're here for you, and we're pretty good at making it so that you can bring your work to a wider audience without you having to take up a whole bunch of time to do it, because we're taking up the time to do it. And then just as far as messaging, I would say, like Hedvig has said, try to get in touch with what it was that interested you in linguistics. If you don't think this is very interesting, you're doing it wrong, because it is interesting. You just have to find, what's the hook? What's the thing that people already know? Or the quirky, weird bit that makes people go, oh, that's kind of odd, because people like that stuff. Try to get in touch with what you found interesting.
Yeah, and I think, just to put my university researcher hat on for a second, I think it's actually the joy of curiosity is a really important thing. And I think it's really important at this moment in time where we're seeing universities increasingly focus on what is commercializable or what is easy to metricize. And it's really hard to metricize joy and enthusiasm, but I think that's all the more reason for us to center that in why we're doing this work. So and yeah, you absolutely don't have to accidentally start a media empire like we've done.
We did.
There are lots of ways for you to start practicing communicating your research to wider audiences. Carrie and
maybe a good.
Meg. Oh yeah, sorry. No, go for it.
I was just I was just going to say a lot of countries, Australia included, if you are a linguist, whether or not you're in academia or not, have various programs for reaching out to like high schools and people who are about to enroll in universities. Australia has OSCLO, there's NACLO for Canada, Linguistics, Lingthusiasm and things. And I actually started my communication linguistics thing by trying to convince high school students to study linguistics. And it's good because they ask you like really hard questions. And I found that very helpful.
Excellent. I'm beginning, Carrie, what would you like to gift bag people? One little thing to pop in the gift bag.
Yeah, so there's lots of ways to disseminate what you already know, and it doesn't have to be a podcast. I just happen to like it, but there's plenty of other ways to do it. YouTube, blogs. But in terms of content, I guess I would just say maybe think about things that you don't actually know that much about and try and find ways to learn more about it. So it's like you're still doing the same thing you're doing in your other life, in your academic life, or what you used to do in your academic life. And you're just like expanding your own mind while you're also providing the service for other people. So you're gonna get like a twofer out of it.
Yeah, mine's related to, I think it's really important that you own your knowledge, but I also think it's important to own that you don't know everything. And I think about how I was the first in my family to go to college. So I think about, I don't like when it feels like people are speaking down to other people or to, like my family, I like when people are humble and say, oh, I don't know what this is, but it's exciting because let's figure it out kind of thing. And it also takes a lot of pressure off of you to just admit that you don't know everything. And so, yeah, just kind of, own what you know, because a lot of people try to take that away from you, but also be okay with saying you don't know the answer to something. You don't have to know everything.
Yeah, I think going back to Hedwig's question to me before, podcasting has definitely made me more comfortable with doing that in lectures and tutorials and just being like, oh, I don't actually have an answer for you right now, but I'll look into it, or we can research it together. That's my favorite pedagogical coping mechanism. Let's look at it together. So yeah, thank you both for sharing that. Also, in terms of platform, just pick up on what you were saying, Carrie, that I think looking at what you enjoy, we all enjoy listening to podcasts, and it's no surprise we've all enjoyed making podcasts. But if you're on TikTok, I want more TikTok linguists. I mean, Gretchen and I spent enough time wondering why there wasn't a linguistics mailing list that we accidentally started one on the topic of accidentally starting media empires. So, if you enjoy signing up for Substack emails, then like making a linguistics mailing list. If you enjoy existing in a particular community, then making linguistics content for that community is a really great way to reach people who may not be engaged with the topic. Gretchen, I've relegated you to last, but do you have any advice that hasn't been covered so far that you'd like to add to the advising?
I think everybody's advice so far has been really good. One of the things that we do with the interviews, and we don't run a lot of interviews because that's a different kind of show, and there are already some great podcasts that do a lot of interviews, so we feel like that's well covered. But one of the things we ask in interviews is we ask people, how did you get into linguistics? How did you get into your current research project? And how to put them in storytelling mode and put them in the mode of, what the where they became interested in the idea and why they found it interesting in the first place and how they get into it. And we don't actually start with, so what do you research, or explain your research to us, because that puts them in like, oh, I'm going to throw some academic jargon terms at you and then try to unpack them, and that can get a little bit too complicated. Whereas if you put them into, how did you get started doing this research? They end up explaining what the research actually is, but they do it in a sort of, well, I was thinking about this type of thing, and then I was wondering about this, and that led me down this question. And that kind of brings people along the idea that like coming up with the research agenda is for humans too. That's a thing people do. They follow their own sets of interests. And like, no one's doing academic linguistics research for like the fame and fortune. So you do try to be, you are interested in something somewhere, and sometimes you take a while to remember that. But there is a level of interest there, and you can kind of follow it. So that's something that we look at when we're doing this. And we also try to make people very comfortable in the interview, because I think for a lot of them it's their first interview maybe, or maybe their second. A lot of us have done interviews with people for whom it's their first interview ever. I think we can make it a good experience for them because we have sort of an additional level of context, and we have sort of the time to, let them have not just like a 30-second soundbite, but like they can actually get into some stories and stuff like that. And we also say to our guests, if you start a story and then you realize that you actually feel like you should know, like there's this person that you meant to remember their research, and you've just forgotten it, and you feel really bad, and you don't want them to think that you've forgotten them, and you want to pause and Google them and look it up, we can just restart that as if you knew it in the first place, because you did know it. You have that sort of prosthetic brain, and that's the magic of editing. We can use it as a bit of a safety net to let our guests feel more comfortable showing off the stuff they do know, because they do know it. They've just forgotten it right now. And they would remember, like, walking out of the interview, oh, how is that name? And so we don't want them to have that kind of experience of regret. And instead we can just pause and Google it, and then just put it in seamlessly, as if they remembered that thing that they were going to remember on the way out anyway. So I think editing can sometimes help with that, and putting kind of questions that put people in a sort of relaxed frame of mind, from a like helping people engage with their research perspective. But like, yeah, you don't have to start a podcast. It's a fair bit of work. You can also be a guest on other people's podcasts.
Thank you for that. I'm going to slightly segue out and say, if you have a question you'd like to ask the whole panel, please feel free to pop it into the chat. If you're watching this on the YouTube live stream, hopefully one of our team are over there keeping an eye on that chat, and will feed it through to us. Yeah, I think the thing I always try and encourage people to do, just to add my own thoughts while people might be typing away, but you can start small. And when I say start small, I mean just make sure that your university researcher website has a biography that clearly states what you do and why you're passionate about it. Be vaguely discoverable on the internet, so that if you do publish an interesting paper, people can find you. You don't have to necessarily do a lot of work. We have some questions that have come in. Termi has asked, Termi's put the caveat here that they feel like this might be a crass question, but I don't think it's a crass question. It's a very practical question, which is, how do you afford to podcast? Where does the money come from? But I think, money is in some ways a little bit indistinguishable from time, and podcasting is a labor intensive as well as somewhat money intensive activity. So if you are all happy to reveal some of the financial realities or business secrets behind how you've set up your shows, Termi would like to hear that. Yeah, I'm happy to just open the floor for these.
So there is a way to do it for free.
Excellent.
Yes. You can host it. Not that ours is completely free, but so we used to be hosted by something that we'd pay monthly into, but now we're on Anchor, which is free.
Yeah.
They also allow you to add ads, which means you can make money from that. You can also, get other advertisers if that's the route you want to go. Most people at least get some of their money from Patreon, including us. But yeah, so you have to record it. So if you have an iPhone, you can actually just record it straight to your iPhone using the mic on your earphone. So it's already, if you already have that, then it's already nothing. You probably want to edit it. Not all of my friends in podcasting edit. We do, but some people don't. So you have to, if you're going to edit, then you need that. But there's plenty of free software, including Audacity. So you can do it for free, and you literally can do it for free.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say that maybe I'll segue into Gretchen here and she can answer for us, but like we because we both have full-time jobs already, have traded, like, you can do it for free, it's very time intensive. We have chosen the do it where we make an amount of money, but we are trading off our time on that. If you want to give a brief introduction to how we do that, Gretchen.
Yeah, so we when we were very initially starting out, I think Lauren edited the first few of our episodes and I did some of our early transcripts, but we very quickly realized that we weren't, like, we both had run our blogs for free where we just put our own time into it, but for the podcast we wanted, it was easier for us to put money into it than for time, and Lauren had a decent paying postdoc, and so she just paid for this for the first little while until Patreon started making some money. So you can decide whether or not you want to kind of cross subsidize money or time, and I think and like we started out by doing, you know, very basic headphones, kind of like this type of headphones. Lauren already had a recorder from fieldwork, and I ended up buying the same model on the theory that if we stopped doing the podcast in a year, I'd be able to resell it to some linguists, because lots of linguists use Zoom recorders. And so the resale value would pretty much be the same. So even if the podcast went belly up, which it has not, I don't think it's going to now, but I was definitely very cautious about, like, am I going to really spend $250 on a recorder so that I can do this? Like, oh, well, I can probably get that back if we stop doing the podcast. So that's a big factor there. So kind of, I think what that speaks to is sort of gradually scaling up as your capacity scales up, because, you know, our first episodes were not as good. The audio quality wasn't as good. We weren't as good at doing them. And when we started doing Patreon, we had like one bonus episode, and you could support us on Patreon and get access to one bonus episode. And like, that was it. And then we did a few more Patreon bonuses, but they were really short because that was easier to edit. It was faster to record. It didn't take up as much of our time. And we didn't start doing full length regular bonus episodes on Patreon. Now we have like 42 bonus episodes or something on Patreon. But that wasn't like, we started off like, here's your 42 episodes you get access to. It was like, no. Here's like, we'll record one bonus. And so gradually scaling that up as you have increased capacity to do so. I think it's a number that I found really useful from Patreon's internal documents when we were starting considering whether or not to start a Patreon for the podcast, was Patreon estimates that 1 to 3% of your regular engaged audience will become a patron. So if you're having less than 1 to 3%, maybe that's a sign you need to tell your audience a bit more about your Patreon or your show. Maybe you need to advertise a bit more. If you're having more than that, then maybe that's a sign you need to figure out how to get more listeners by, you know, being guests on other people's shows and cross promoting or doing these types of things like that. So thinking about it in terms of like, okay, if you're trying to aim for 1 to 3% of people are going to become patrons, that's not a huge number. And that can also kind of help decide when it makes sense to start a Patreon. Because if you have, 100 listeners and 1 to 3% of them become patrons, that's like 1 to 3 people. So you're going to making maybe like $5 to $15. And maybe that's not worth the effort of running a whole Patreon just to make $5 a month. Like, there are lower effort ways of making $5 a month that you could do before doing that. Like, I think that's
technically you could not put anything up on Patreon and just still ask for money. So
right,
it could still be low effort. There are people who do that. So there is still a way to do it low effort. So some people suggest that you start a Patreon page right away, because eventually you'll get there. We didn't. We waited like at least 6 months, but I don't know. I think it's lots of ways to do it.
I think it can be good to like build a goodwill before immediately starting one, because people who have never even heard of you aren't going to start suddenly give you money. Like, they have to become a fan of your thing first, and then they're like, oh, I love this thing so much, I'm going to support it. Like, random strangers aren't going to drive by and immediately become patrons. Like, they want to listen to some free episodes.
I'm just going to be the moderator and just to ask briefly, Hedwig and Daniel, if you have any other insights on the time, money, effort interface of funding or managing a podcast.
We love our patrons. They help us out so much. I think we would
the correct
kind of be remiss. We would kind of be remiss if we didn't say this is a tough gig. I was on an LSA media thing last year with a bunch of great people, including the late Jeff Nunberg. And somebody dropped the question, how do you make it pay? And there was a huge silence. And then the answer from most of the linguists was, already have tenure and then you can do what you want. This is a gig that in many ways benefits people who already are well off and who have privilege. And the system of paying for these things, if you're an academic, the system for funding your outreach is broken. My way of doing it has been, I loved doing this, so I stopped teaching. And I had to have my own ways of funding myself and keeping it going. And I think it's worth it, but I know that that's not an option for everybody.
Yeah, we're lucky that the show is kind of self-sustaining now, and that lets us keep, it's very simple that we couldn't afford to keep doing it if we had to spend even more time on it than we already are. So we're also grateful that Patreon exists as a funding model where we're not reliant on an institution to support the show. And it can
I gotta say, for Carrie and I think it's mostly a labor of love. We're not making money off of this. We're using our Patreon to fund transcripts. So it really is, I guess, just being honest, it's like, you know, we definitely do not rely on that for a living at all.
Just a brief shout out to Sarah Dopiorella, who is in Linguistics in the Pub today. Hi, Sarah. She is the transcription wizard behind both our shows.
Yeah.
Great.
Lovely too.
Great. If you're running a linguistics podcast and you need somebody who already knows a lot of linguistics terms to transcribe it and already knows the IPA to transcribe it, you can get Sarah to do it. And I think, and like having other things going on. So like I also wrote a book that came out last year, and
look, Gretchen, I put it in the video for you.
There it is.
Oh, thank you.
Like a proud aunt that I am.
Ended up doing a lot of publicity for the book last year, and then some of those interviews that I did would also mention that I had a podcast. So we had a bunch of new listeners because they came in because they read the book and they were like, oh, she has a podcast too. And that wasn't something that I was like planning in that sort of way, but you know, doing multiple things can cross-pollinate, or sometimes Lauren will be like, oh, I had this thing come up in teaching that, you know, somebody wanted to know this, and so like we'll do this. But like we both have jobs doing other things. And I think letting other parts of your life cross-pollinate what you're doing, and it's not just one thing, like, oh, you're a linguistics podcaster and you don't talk about anything else.
We have two other questions in the chat, and so I think if you guys don't mind, we'll spend maybe 5 or so minutes at least on both of those, just addressing them, and then we'll still have kind of conscious that if we go up until the half hour, then we won't be detaining anyone longer than we promised them. So we'll spend another 5 minutes or so on these questions. We'll kind of wrap up the panel and give people an opportunity to break out into discussion groups keep with the...
Lauren, we've had a bit of a behind the scenes change.
Oh, okay, cool, great. Hi, Ruth.
When we thought maybe we wouldn't do the breakout groups.
That's okay. So that means people, if you have any pressing questions that you are hoping to ask a podcaster, get them into that chat. Thanks for the update, Ruth. I'm okay with that because they're 2 great questions, and I'm glad to be able to spend more than 5 minutes on them. Alexander has asked if you have advice, and I like this one because I think we're going to have 3 very different answers, but advice for tackling controversial topics. I will let you define for yourselves what you think a controversial topic is, because I think that's going to vary across the 3 podcasts. Anyone want to take this first? I'm just going to keep doing kind of prattly floor holding talk while you come up with your answers.
I feel like Carrie and I have the most obviously controversial, that at least, okay, so if we're defining it as maybe something that's making people uncomfortable, might make you feel like, oh, I have done something wrong. You know, I believed one thing and it's, you know, someone's telling me it's something else. I actually have the same advice that I did for just being a public facing linguist, which is be humble and admit that when you also thought something, or when you grew, admit that there's a learning curve, admit that you're going to make mistakes with it, even when you're talking about it then, not just like, you know, in life, but at that very moment when you're talking about it. Yeah, I feel like I've done that on the podcast where I've been like, oh, I used to do that. And I'm so glad that you're teaching me this right now. Carrie?
Yeah, and so controversial it's a tricky term. So what do you mean by that?
I thought things that make people feel uncomfortable was pretty good.
Yeah, so if it just means that, then if as long as you're comfortable talking about it, then who cares if it sometimes makes some people uncomfortable? Because almost anything can make someone uncomfortable. So just as long as you're not being an asshole about it, I think it's fine. Now, if it's something that you don't actually have that much background on and you don't know how to answer the question, that's when you bring in someone else who can talk about the thing. So I think that's how we handle it. Either we can talk about it because we are intimately aware of how these things work, or we bring in someone else because we just don't feel like we're actually the experts to talk about it.
To kind of go to the other end of the topic spectrum, because I feel, Gretchen, we've made a very conscious decision to not make Lingthusiasm topical in some respects. So we've possibly kind of taken the opposite tact, but I think we have a very different, and not to say that it's like either approach is necessarily better or worse. I love that there's a spectrum of approaches to controversial linguistics topics in the podcasting space, but I have some feelings about how we approach things, but do you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, I think one thing that we do with Lingthusiasm is certain kinds of things like, don't be judgy a judgy person, judgy McJudgy pants about language and this kind of stuff. Like we've done a couple myth-busty episodes about like kids these days aren't ruining language, but a lot of what we end up doing is sort of implicitly modeling a different way of approaching language without being overt about that all the time. Without saying like, you had these wrong beliefs where you were criticizing people for how they were talking, and we're going to tell you the correct beliefs. A lot of what we do is implicitly we don't model the way that people talk. Like the way people talk about language often is like, oh, I have a pet peeve, here are some more pet peeves, and people who are judgy about language aren't justifying their judginess, they're just assuming that everyone else is as judgy. So one of the decisions that we made when we started the podcast is like, what if we assumed the opposite? What if we assumed that no one was ever judgy, or that like maybe some people somewhere are, but like nobody we ever talk to is judgy? And we know that's not how the world exists. But what it does do is it
nice to pretend.
It's an interesting pretense, and it's a way of letting people update their beliefs without necessarily having to have the cognitive dissonance of I am wrong and I'm attacked. I was wrong and I was attacked, and I'm going to be double down on these beliefs. It's a way of letting people kind of update their beliefs without quite realizing how much they've changed from one step to the next. And what's been interesting is that we've received a number of messages from listeners being like, I used to be so judgmental about language, and then I started listening to your podcast and I realized there was another way. And we're like, that's really interesting, because we don't do a lot of explicit messaging on that. We just do a lot of implicit. Of course, this is normal. It is completely normal to just be excited and curious and interested in language, and everything, and like lots of features of language are really great and interesting, and nothing is ever a pet peeve. And so it's an approach that appeals to a different kind of listener, and I'm happy that lots of different approaches to this exist. And I think that when someone has been first approached with like, wow, okay, I don't actually need to be judgy about language, they can then listen to something like Vocal Fries, where they've like kind of deeply rooting out all of these specific core beliefs. But first they have to even believe that it's possible to not want to be judgy about language in the first place. So it kind of meets people at two different places on their journey towards, I don't know, enlightenment. But it can sometimes being being more implicit about it can also work to help people update their beliefs as well.
Yeah, I think the kind of behind the scenes fun bit for me is figuring out what the opposite of the boringly standard peeve is. That's actually like one of the funnest bits of the myth busty episodes, is that we do all this heavy lifting before we record on making sure that we don't model the negative version of the myth and create this like great world of if
like,
the opposite is
a lot of myth-bust type things do sort of, oh, what if we just like asked the myth as a question in the episode? No, because people will answer the question in the way that you're trying to bust. So rather than like, are kids ruining language, or like, kids, they're not actually, they're doing okay, the kids, they're doing such a great job with language. All kids, they're okay. Which I don't even think we quite got that far in the title of the episode, and I kind of wish we had now been like, kids, they're doing a great job with language.
Yeah.
To really put what's the positive version of that, and why is it positive?
I think, yeah, we go even harder on that now, and it's fun.
Yeah.
Daniel and Hedwig, what is your approach? Because I think this is a great, sorry, just to tell you what's great about your podcast. I think one thing that makes Because Language, I think, different in some ways, but we kind of do this to a lesser extent, but having Ben on as the non-linguist gives you the opportunity to have a very different perspective modeled in episodes. And I kind of love Ben's journey to thinking. He has kind of started thinking like a linguist and possibly doesn't even know that after so many years of episodes.
Yeah, he doesn't realize he's a linguist. He essentially is, yeah.
That's the big reveal.
Daniel. Yeah. I think everyone said
he's been on this journey, and in the early days, 5-6 years ago, he was like, this is terrible and I'm going to take some convincing, and now he's come on board, and now we occupy this really weird medium zone, because Lingthusiasm is like, hey, everything's awesome and language is cool and fun, and then with the vocal fries, it's like, all right, people, we've got some work to do here. And we kind of straddle both. We're kind of in the middle, because sometimes I'm like, hey, let's bring out the fun of language and be super positive, because I try not to be super negative. And then sometimes we're like, you know what? We got big problems, folks. There's trouble in River City. So, how do we do it? I don't know. It just goes, you just got to feel your way along, and don't lose the positivity, but also say, there's work.
Yeah.
I think everyone was saying really good things, and something that running this show, I mean, so all of us have sort of talked about the uncomfortableness of like people having very prescriptivist ideas, but there are a lot of other controversial topics that we cover as well. Like, we just had a recent episode where we talked to Hannah Gibson about how colonialism and racism is part of the linguistics heritage, and that makes me uncomfortable. That's part of my research discipline. That's part of the literature that I read. I read papers from the 60s that are racist. And that does make me uncomfortable, and it's not something that I encounter in my linguistics education. It's something that I hope we're doing an okay job of doing, but I think it's important, like I think Megan was saying as well, that to be humble and acknowledge when we don't know things, and say, this is a gap in my knowledge and we should have someone on to talk more about it. And also acknowledge if we do screw up in some sort of way, which I hope we don't, but if we do, we should be honest about it.
We've been doing that every episode. We're like, oh, we said an accidentally racist thing, and here's what it is, and here's why. Maybe think about not doing that if that's your jam.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, thanks, Alexander, for this question, because I think it shows that whatever the end state result is, the important thing is to have a sufficient degree of self-reflexivity and a degree of like awareness that you won't always get everything right, allows you to not blunder into trying to maintain a position that is not actually maintainable or should not be maintainable, is probably the more important thing. We just have one more question, and I want to make sure that we give it time as well. Because I think it ties back nicely to thinking about being linguists who communicate to the general public, but also thinking about how we straddle our roles. Gerald has asked how you think about your relationship to the broader linguistic community. We're all public-facing podcasts, but do you think about linguists as part of your audience? And if so, how do you How do you think about, I guess, the different audiences that you're reaching in your show?
Well, this actually relates to the last question. Yes, we do obviously think about the linguists in our audience as well. But our last episode was all about white supremacy in the field. Outsiders, I mean, we have to think about white supremacy in all fields and in all parts of our lives. So it's still, relevant to many people in the world. But that topic was still very much about linguistics and linguists. And so, yeah, it depends on the topic. It depends on who we're talking to, how much of it we think is actually for linguists and how much of it we think is for everybody else.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think, a lot of times I think of linguists most of all, because I think that as a linguist, I can say that we're not doing so great and that we need to grow within the field. It's not just non-linguists who partake in linguistic discrimination. It just was our example of our podcast. And I see it on Twitter, I really, I think honestly, at some points I think of linguists most of all because some of us are stuck in the idea that maybe we don't need to grow because we got our PhD in linguistics, or we've been thinking about this all the time, but we all have room to grow. So I absolutely think about other linguists all the time.
Came on Talk to Talk and then Cross Language as a linguist and enjoying the show as a linguist. So I think about that too. And I've been quite pleasantly surprised that the things that interested me as a linguist were that interesting to non-linguists actually. And that we are able to do both because it is possible.
Yeah, I think about the linguist stuff all the time. About a quarter of our audience on one survey we just did said, yep, I am a linguist, both academic and not. 1/4. So if that were any higher or lower, I would be kind of worried because having a lot of linguists means, oh, maybe the show is a little too, a little too advanced. So making sure that we're keeping it linguistic, but also it's easy enough for a lay audience to understand. That's a balance that we try to hit, and we keep monitoring that one.
That's why it's good to have Ben on, but we're hoping he doesn't, but he has become a linguist. Maybe we need to bring someone else on who's even less of a linguist.
Time for the old memory zapper.
Yeah.
Back to lay status for you, Ben.
Time to reboot the Ben.
That's a very good place.
I think we're probably the podcast that has the most ratio of non-linguists in our audience, and we do that deliberately because we're kind of a gateway drug to the rest of linguistics. Then hopefully people follow, the links and show notes and various things to other places where they can hang out with linguists and get sort of bitten by that bug. I would say that when, some linguists will say to me like, oh, my students really like your podcast, but I don't actually listen to it. I'm like, no, it's okay. You don't have to. You know what an adjective is. What I would generally recommend is people who are linguists already to listen to our interviews, because we do, like, the interviews, they're accessible, but they're with people who are talking about their particular research and their particular, angle on the research. And that's something that's going to be newer and more interesting to people who are already practicing linguists. And it's not going to be, here's 30 minutes about adjectives, which a lot of linguists probably already know. So that's kind of how I see our relationship with the broader linguistic community. We don't do a ton of interview episodes, but we choose pretty carefully who we're going to interview and what we're going to talk about. And those are the ones that I think speak more directly to the linguistics community.
Just to gently contradict you. Well, not to contradict, just to have a compliment. I think there are two things we talk about when we talk about the linguistics community, or the linguistic community, which is that we do have some people who are linguists who are they listen because they do enjoy the conference corridor chats, which is somewhat what the show is modeled on. Those chats you have when you get a bunch of linguists together at the pub, or the Zoom pub as we're now in. But we also have a lot of people listen who studied linguistics and miss having other people who've studied linguistics and are enthusiastic about linguistics to talk to. And I think as a field, we have not necessarily done a good job of letting those people feel like they're part of the linguistic community. It's one of the reoccurring things that happens when I do linguistics job interviews with people who've studied linguistics and gone on to careers in a whole range of fields, they're like, oh, I just miss talking to linguists. And I think we've missed an opportunity as a field. You think about something like the astrophysicists are really great at this, and the astronomers, and the physicists are really good at keeping people who studied physics at high school or university feeling like they're connected to a group of people who are knowledge making. And I see all three of our podcasts, and any linguistics communication that you can do as a researcher is really important in keeping those people connected, because they are great advocates for the field in whatever industry they're working in, whether they are directly working in a way that lets them be a linguist, or if they're working in a way that lets them use their linguistic soft skills in really interesting ways. So that's my gentle I think there are two different communities that we're talking about when we talk about the linguistic community.
I think that kind of to bring it back to, linguistics on the internet, or linguistics in the pub, there's a sense, I remember when I was in grad school, when sometimes somebody would be like, oh, this paper, it's really interesting. Where is that author now? And you'd hear somebody say oh, well, they left the field, as if they died. Or maybe they got a job as an English teacher in a high school or something.
Yeah.
That's fine, they're not dead. And I think that's something that the internet has made that a lot harder to do, because, or in a very good way, because you now still have people that you went to grad school with on Facebook when they have non-academic jobs, or you can, stay in touch with people on Twitter even if they have non-academic jobs and stuff. And the feeling like you're part of those conversations, or feeling like you kind of know what's going on, or that you have this sort of oh, interesting thing about language, or here's a cutting edge issue in the field, or here's something that we need to be thinking about as a field. Feeling like you can still be part of those conversations is something that podcasts can do really well, and not having people who haven't been in an academic linguistics department still feel like they're part of the linguistics conversation.
We have a few more minutes for any final thoughts, anything you thought of,
or people who might be the only linguist in their department or something like that. Anyway, yes.
Any other thoughts? Any other shameless plugs for your own podcasts, please? Please and thank you. Now is the time.
This is not a plug for us. It's just more of a plug for if you do want to start a podcast. It is a lot of work, but it's also a very creative space. So you can do something that no one's ever done before, and it might work, it might not work, but at least you can try. So there's no one right way to be a podcaster. There's no one right way to produce a podcast. It can be all kinds of things. So maybe there's some kind of way you want to do a fiction podcast that's also linguistic somehow. I don't know. There's just lots of things you could do. So I encourage you to at least try and just throw some spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah, it is definitely a creative outlet. Go ahead. That's all I wanted to say. It's a creative outlet.
No, I can't remember the name of it now, but maybe one if you remember. There's a smartphone app that lets you make a podcast if it's less than 10 minutes. They set up the entire flow for you, and they have a little audio editing in it. And you can record a little 10-minute podcast if you want, and make a feed within 2 minutes. And I did it once, and I made no one dig this up. I can't remember what that's called, but it's very, very low effort podcasting, the lowest effort. If you ever want to try it out.
Podbean or Anchor, was that it? People are asking. Cool.
No.
Yeah, we have a couple other linguistics podcasters in the comments. I'm just seeing Anna Ballou from the Endangered Language Project.
Hi, Anna. Another good one.
There's a SoundCloud for ELP, which I didn't realize, so that's great. And Martha from Field Notes also has a podcast about language documentation.
Also excellent in the chat. Thank you all for being here. If you could please use the novelty applause reaction on the Zoom, or put in your emoji of appreciation into the chat for our panelists today. Please subscribe to Because Language and/or the Vocal Fries and/or Lingthusiasm. Share them with your linguist and non-linguist friends. I hope we've inspired you to think a little bit more about, if you are a linguist, how you be a linguist in the world and share your passion and enthusiasm for linguistics with broader audiences. A few of us might be able to hang around. I am, once we stop recording, going back to toddler wrangling, but a few of us can stay. That brings an end to this session. Sorry, Hedwig, yes, just to... If
everyone here smiles when I count to 3, I can do a screenshot later of the stream and we'll get a cute little picture.
Excellent.
Are you ready? I'm not going to take it now. I'm going to go to YouTube and okay. 1, 2, 3. There we go. Okay, now I have something to grab. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Excellent. I love working with a bunch of people who are thinking about media. And next Linguistics in the Pub will probably happen much like this one. It'll be in a month or 2. We'll randomly, a week beforehand, remember to send out a notification. Ruth, is there a topic under discussion yet?
Not yet, but for those who hang around, we might talk about what to do next month.
Excellent. Yes, as always, I mean, still a Melbourne-centric organising committee, but it is another forum in which we encourage people to come back, say signed up to the Linguistics in the Pub Eventbrite. We do tend to alternate between UK and US time zone friendly events, so we might have something later in the day for Brits who want to do a breakfast in the pub. It always kind of depends on the topic and who the guests are. So if you want to encourage some UK-based people to propose a topic or get involved, then we can have a UK-friendly time zone event next time. So yes, you can.
Field Notes is based in the UK, right?
Or Europe.
No, Marty is now back in the US, but Field Notes is not a geography; it's a state of mind. Marty interviews linguists from all over the world doing field work. It's a great, yeah, Marty's in Seattle at the moment. So I have a list of language and linguistics podcasts over on Superlingo. This is just a small handful of the field. There's lots out there. Thank you all for being here. That concludes the kind of formal portion of Linguistics in the Pub. Please feel free